Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you all for coming. So we are EcoCareers, a campaign under Environmental Society, which promotes green jobs to students at Imperial. So each month we will invite guest speakers to share their work experience and thoughts on environmental sustainability. So joining us today is Zion Lights. If any of you have any questions for her, feel free to type them into the chat, and there will be a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, please welcome Zion.
Hi everyone, just give me a second, I'm going to get my slides up. Okay, so let's see if this works. Does that work?
Yes, it's working.
Okay, great. Okay, so this talk is going to be a little bit about my journey as an environmental activist and the various things I've done over the years and where I've ended up now and what I'm doing now. So, and I also want to talk about climate justice, because this is really important to me and it's something that you probably hear talked about a lot, but isn't often very well defined. So we're going to cover that a little bit later. So first of all, let's do a little introduction about me. So this is me about 12 years ago. On the right, this was where I helped to shut down a bank in Scotland, RBS Bank, because they were investing in tar sands. And on the left, we have Camp for Climate Action. This was an activist group that used to meet every year. It was quite similar to Extinction Rebellion, but much, much smaller, not as popular. There were a few hundred of us, and every year we would meet, we would do a different direct action to shut something down, to sort of protest. You know, one year it was coal-fired power stations, I got arrested that year. Another year it was tar sands, that picture on the right. And you know, it was really important to us then to do this action for climate change, but it was about 10 years ago and people didn't really care at that time. So I think actually we were a little bit too early. And another thing I used to do is I used to do these anti-nuclear protests, which I'm ashamed to say now because I've educated myself about this, but it's important to mention this because when you're in the environmental movement traditionally, they tend to be quite anti a lot of scientific things like nuclear, GMOs, you know, things that actually we have now found we need, you know, we need to help combat climate change. So we'll cover that a little bit later. So years ago, about 10 years ago, I campaigned at university to get them to switch to renewable energy. So at the time, the message of the green movement was very much, this is how we decarbonize, this is how we wean off of fossil fuels. And I understood back then that we couldn't just do it with renewables alone, right? Because as this chart shows, you know, you can have lots of solar or wind, you know, potential generation, but actually if it's not sunny enough any given day, then that drops. So this chart just shows sort of across the year, you have really good high capacity in the sunny months and you don't have it for the rest of the year. And the sad fact is that the rest of the year, you're then backed up by coal. So that's what happens in Britain. You can check it any day. You can go to electricitymap.org any day. It will tell you exactly what our electricity mix is for the day. And it will tell you how much solar and how much wind we have. And what you see is when they're really high, it's really good. But when they drop, the coal goes up. And that's true even today, that the UK is most days burning coal. So I used to advocate for this, but I understood that it wasn't, you know, really good enough. But I also didn't know what else to advocate for apart from renewables, because the backup is fossil fuels. And I also didn't like nuclear. So it was quite a difficult thing to get my head around at the time. And what I used to say is, look, battery storage for renewables is around the corner. When we have that, we will just be able to run on just renewables. But actually 10 years later, I'm now admitting that that is not an argument that we can continue to make, because that storage hasn't become available. So then I was like, okay, what's the solution? So again, the green groups, traditionally, the green groups will tell you this is what you should do. You should lower your carbon footprint. So I wrote a book. So I had children And I thought this is the time to help educate the world, you know, not shutting down banks anymore, but maybe I can write a book. It's evidence-based. I read hundreds of studies for it, which are all referenced in the back of the book. And it was about how to live with a low carbon footprint. You know, what do you eat? How do you travel? What are all the options? So I did this because I believed that, okay, we can't just have renewables because that will require backup of fossil fuels. So maybe actually a solution is we reduce our energy. So this is kind of the message I was pushing. And again, 10 years later, 10, 20 years later, the same message is what the environmental groups call for. And I think this is actually now problematic. So we're going to cover that in a minute. And one of the reasons it's problematic is because the best report that says that we can get the world running on 100% renewables is this report. It's the Zero Carbon Britain report. And if you read it, you know, it's very clear there. I'm happy to send these slides afterwards so you can have a proper look. That it requires us to reduce energy use by 60%. Now that is a lot to have to reduce. That's, you know, we're not talking about just not leaving your TV on. We're talking about 60% less lighting and clothes washing and all of the things, you know, charging your phone and your laptop, all the things that we're accustomed to. But the more complicated thing is that as developing countries are being lifted out of poverty, they're using more energy. So we can't really tell them now that they, as they build infrastructure and develop all the things that we develop to have a high quality of life, we can't really tell them that they have to make this reduction. But that is what's happening. The kind of green groups and the NGOs, environmental NGOs, are pushing that message. And again, I think this is wrong. And I think actually kind of goes against what I understand climate justice to be. So people ask me why I talk about energy so much. I'm not an energy nerd. I don't have a background in energy. I have a master's in science communication. You know, I'm really into the communication side of research. But the more I started looking at climate change, the more it kept coming back to energy. Because if you look at this chart, it just shows you that is the biggest chunk of the pie. Like we can sort out agriculture, we can rewild, we can eat less meat, we can do all of those things. But the biggest issue is energy. It's the way that we live in a day-to-day way where we're very dependent on lots of electricity. So talking about climate justice, this is, you know, my family. So my family, my parents migrated to Britain in the 60s from this little village in the Punjab in India. And this is how they live over there. So I just went, you know, I wasn't born there, but I went for a visit, sitting on my mum here in this picture. And this is very eye-opening for me. I mean, I went when I was younger, but honestly, I didn't remember a lot then, but I went again when I was older. And then this was very eye-opening to me because it kind of went against all of the messages that I'd been taught as an environmentalist. So I'm saying use less energy, live in this idyllic way with very little. And then I went to this village where they live in this very, not idyllic, but very low energy way. You know, they don't have access to lighting. They don't have infrastructure, so they don't have access to hospitals and medication and vaccinations. All the things that come from having the infrastructure that we have, they don't have. And what that requires is a huge amount of energy. So the way that we developed to have all of those things was that we burned loads of fossil fuels. And now we have governments, world leaders, environmental groups telling these countries like India and Africa that they can't have this, that we don't want them to burn the fossil fuels. So actually, you know, as I say, I was arrested twice 10 years ago for protesting fossil fuels. So I'm not at all supporting them, but it made me completely rethink. When I went back there and I looked around, I thought they need something, and it's not a few solar panels that some days give them electricity and some days don't. Now that's fine if you want to live off grid and you don't mind if your fridge goes off and your food goes off and stuff like that. But actually, to have the high quality of life we have, we do have to have reliable electricity. I think actually we kind of take this for granted. You come home, you turn on the light, you expect it to work, and the light does work. You know, you literally shut out the darkness. In this village, no, you don't. You don't get that option. It's dark. It's dark. You're vulnerable. You're miles from anywhere. You don't have access to all the things that we have access to: education, hospitals. And really, when you're talking about reliable electricity, you're talking about things like hospitals, right? Because hospitals need to function 24/7. They cannot just rely on renewables that will then inevitably lead to blackouts. This is not okay. So they will always need a backup. So I started kind of thinking, is that backup, what's that backup going to be if it's not fossil fuels? And I had to start rethinking my position on nuclear energy because I care about climate justice. I care about the way that these people live in the world. And I started to realize that a lot of these groups that I was part of, very much a part of, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, WWF, Camp for Climate Action, these groups that I was a part of are very privileged in a way. We have high access to energy. You know, we have access to hospitals and education. We're very educated. We're very privileged. And we talk about climate justice when we're not really thinking about what that means to these people. And what it means to these people is they need to develop. And the one thing that has been shown again and again by countless data is that it is development that lifts people out of poverty. And the problem is, of course, that means that emissions are going to go up. And this is at a time when our emissions have to come down because we're in a climate emergency. We have left it far too late to act. We are locked into 1.5 warming now. That's going to happen whether we like it or not, but we can still reduce a lot of the harm. And, you know, again, recently someone else created this report, which was 100%, another kind of 100% renewables. This is how we run the world on 100% renewables. And again, it says that in this, India has to have less than 5 times the amount of energy that America has. And it's not enough. It's not enough for these countries to develop, to give them intermittent energy, intermittent electricity sources. You know, you can't build the infrastructure that we had with just a few solar panels or a few wind farms that then cannot provide what you need when it's not sunny or windy. They have to have a backup. And what really changed my mind was I became a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. I, you know, spoke on debates and things all around the world for that. You probably saw me on the Andrew Neil show. And I found it very difficult when I was on the Andrew Neil show and he asked me for solutions. And he asked me how we're going to replace our reliance on gas. And I really wanted to say at that point, nuclear energy. And the reason I wanted to say that is because if you look at the IPCC report, this report came out in 2018. It was the 1.5 warming report. And it has a section on energy. And it's the mitigation section that gives us 4 different decarbonisation pathways for how to get to net zero. So this is not opinion. This is literally just data. It's just numbers. How are we going to do it? And this, you know, these numbers are crunched by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's top scientists. So this is kind of good news. They're giving us a solution. But if you look at the decarbonisation pathways, there's 4 different alternatives, but all of them rely on a large amount of renewables and a large amount of nuclear. It's the only way to get off of fossil fuels. So one thing that happened was I sat there as a spokesperson and I realised I couldn't do this job anymore because I couldn't actually talk about the solutions I wanted to talk about. And the other thing was that I knew that it's a contentious issue, as is carbon capture storage, which also is in that same report. These tend to be things that traditional environmentalists don't like. And I think actually that has done a lot of damage over time, over the years. This is a simple fact. This is from Oxford, Our World in Data, Oxford University's Our World in Data. They crunch numbers, they do the research. It's actually, if you go to their website, they've got amazing resources on energy poverty, how to tackle poverty, how to lift people out of poverty through expanding electricity initiatives. And they've got a lot on there about what's safe and what's reliable and what we should use. And this is it. Nuclear stand there, safe as wind and solar. And hydropower is great. Hydropower is actually more dangerous than nuclear power because there have been more deaths from it. When there are dam disasters, they tend to have a high death toll. But still, you have to look at it in context of this chart, which is the top ones have got to go, right? The top ones are so polluting and dangerous, and they are driving catastrophic climate change, and they have to go. And the problem is that the people who are most pushing for change, which tends to be the climate activists, they don't like the solution, one of the solutions on here, which is nuclear energy. And so what you end up with is a continued reliance on fossil fuels. And you'll hear lots of arguments that I had to kind of overcome myself, which was things like fear of radiation. Well, I learned that radiation is natural, comes from space. Everything's a little bit radioactive. Hardly any actually comes from nuclear. So these are all things that I believed that I was wrong about. And it's very easy to go and look up and do your own research on this. I learned about waste. This is a waste storage facility in the Netherlands called Kovra. They've made it into a really nice art museum and gallery, and you can go inside. And these canisters on the right, that's where they store the waste. So it seems scary, but it's completely safe. They take it out of the ground. It's naturally radioactive. They use it. So it's less radioactive. Then they bury it again in layers of concrete. The stuff is so thick, they test it by flying planes into it, and it doesn't even dent. So a good example is Fukushima. People often say to me, Fukushima is really scary and lots of people were hurt. Actually, they weren't hurt from the nuclear facility. The Fukushima Daiichi power plant melted down. Yes, technically, I don't think we should use that phrase actually, but that's what all the news reported. But it didn't harm anyone. And even the waste that was stored on site was hit by an earthquake and a tsunami, and it didn't harm anyone. The people that died something like 20,000 people, were because of the earthquake and tsunami and nothing to do with the power plant there. So these are all things I had to learn, and I kind of had to unlearn and relearn. And it was quite a difficult journey, but really it comes down to this: do you believe, you know, scientific data that we have here on the left, or do you believe misinformation? That's it. You know, when it comes to vaccinations, we're very clear that we believe, you know, evidence and we're going to get vaccinated. But then when it comes to climate solutions, for some reason, we push nuclear away and we want to believe in this 100% renewable reality, and it just doesn't add up. And the prime example of this is Germany. So Germany has put billions of pounds into renewables. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because people need to fund stuff. People need to fund solutions, and they need to see what works and what doesn't. But Germany actually burns so much coal now because they shut down their nuclear power stations, they invested in renewables, and there was nothing to replace the nuclear. It always is fossil fuels if you shut down your nuclear power stations. And you know, this chart shows you everything, because France is on here with a very good energy mix. France has one of the cleanest energy mixes in Europe and in the world. It has over 70% nuclear energy. It has that because in the 70s, and over about a decade, they built over 50 power plants, and that provides their electricity, and that's it. You know, and they have very cheap electricity. It's very reliable. It provides good, clean jobs. It's all well managed. There's never been a single disaster or any issue there with nuclear power. And, you know, I keep saying to people, these are actually good, clean, green jobs, and they kind of need to be rebranded as that, because that is the future. And imagine if all the countries had decarbonized like France, we would all have that low energy mix, and then we wouldn't be heading for 1.5 warming. That's the truth. You know, we wouldn't be in this state right now. And that would then enable the countries that are going to be hardest hit by climate change to develop the infrastructure they need, even if they required fossil fuels to do it, so that they have some protection from the dangers that are coming to their countries. So this chart shows the cleanest energy mixes in the world. How did they decarbonize? How did they get their emissions down? This is it. They used nuclear power and renewables, but in this case, most of it was hydro. Hydro is very, very good if you live in a country where you can have lots of hydro, which isn't every country. But these are the ones that managed to do it. And most of them are, you know, as you see with France there, they just use a lot of nuclear, and Sweden as well. And they have very low emissions. So these are the kind of climate leaders, which is, you know, where we should all be aiming to be, really. And there's another thing when I talk about climate justice that I like to bring up, which is air pollution, because this is a crisis that has been going on for decades and nobody really cares about it. Nobody talks about it. We're talking about, you know, millions of deaths a year, something like 8 to 9 million deaths a year from fossil fuel generated air pollution. Now, that's a lot of deaths. And before we were talking about the climate crisis, I wish we had been talking about this, because this alone to me is a reason to wean off of fossil fuels. And actually, if you look at those deaths, it is almost always the most disadvantaged people, because they live in the most polluted areas. So they can't afford to move away from the local coal power station, you know, coal-fired power station. They can't afford to move away from the most polluted areas. And they live in really dire circumstances. And I met a family that lives in Poland near a coal-fired power station. They have a lot of coal that they're burning in Poland. And they said they can't open their windows because they're covered in soot. Their son has chronic asthma. They all have breathing problems. They can't afford to move. And it's really sad, because actually in Britain, we would never, ever allow a coal-fired power station to be built here. We would never allow it. Our green groups would just shut that down. It would never happen. But we burn coal all the time. When it's not windy or sunny enough and we need a backup, we burn coal, and it comes from there. So we outsource that cost to poor families and other countries, to poorer countries. And I think it's just, you can't talk about climate justice and not accept that this is a reality of what's happening. So what do? Well, actually, fossil fuels, I don't think they're going to go without a fight. I think, you know, we've known about climate change for decades. Before I was born, there was good data. The data's got more robust over time. Extinction Rebellion came on the scene with Fridays for the Future, and they helped to draw attention to this and make people sit up and say, we need to take action. But actually, we're still just really dependent on fossil fuels. And as you probably see now with the gas hikes and all of this, these problems that are happening, we've got ourselves in a really difficult position, because we have not chosen to do what France did and get a clean energy source that we're, you know, in control of. We have some energy independence over, with clean emissions. We have with no emissions. We have instead made ourselves reliable on an industry, the fossil fuel industry, that we know has covered up the truth about climate change, has funded climate denial. And, you know, sadly, the one thing that could displace fossil fuels, which is nuclear energy, the green groups have been against it too. So Sierra Club here against it. These are all recent pages. There was this campaign in America where people were leafleted through their doors telling them, you know, don't vote for nuclear to be funded, you know, vote against nuclear, no nuke bailout. And if you look at the bit that I've circled there, look at who it was paid by. It was paid by the API, the American Petroleum Institute. They're very, very big players, very big fossil fuel interests. So the reason they're doing this is because they know that if you build lots of nuclear, you don't need the fossil fuels anymore. And actually, they like renewables. These are real adverts from fossil fuel companies. They call them perfect partners, committed to natural gas and committed to solar energy, because they know if we build more renewables, we just need more backup, and it's going to be fossil fuels or it's going to be nuclear. So this has been happening for a while, and there is a real problem that the kind of old school traditional environmentalists, the kind of boomer generation, have been against nuclear for a long time, like a long time. Oh, I don't think that's going to play. And that has led to where we are now, where we are facing catastrophic climate change. I'm not going to play this video, but it's a video by Shell promoting renewables as a perfect partner to gas. But I think I've made that point. You know, we have Greenpeace celebrating BP, who we know funded climate denial, because they're saying they're going to invest in renewable energy. Why do you think they're investing in renewable energy? I'm not saying that renewables don't bring good, clean jobs. They do, and we should build them. But they are not green if the backup is fossil fuels. We have to be honest about that. And we have to look at our fears of nuclear energy, because we have all these fears that have come from watching things like The Simpsons and the China syndrome. And we think that it's, you know, so dangerous. One thing that I always find when I talk about nuclear to people is they talk about waste, but did you know that coal ash is more radioactive than nuclear waste, and it isn't stored anywhere? They've been found to just dump it places. You know, you can look this up. It's actually a huge issue. So isn't that interesting that the dialogue has turned against nuclear and waste, but it hasn't on fossil fuels? You know, I actually think that's probably quite a deliberate move by fossil fuel companies again. So there have been environmentalists coming out on this. So this is great. You know, this is George Monbiot wrote a couple of articles like a decade ago, and more recently as well. But this was sort of his big one. And he had a lot of backlash about that at the time, and he went quiet for a little bit. But I think he's talking about it again some more now, because he's realised actually it's a solution. But it's not an easy solution to push for. You know, I get called an industry shill, and I get called, you know, all kinds of stuff. I don't work with industry. I have no connections with industry. You know, but it's interesting because when I used to promote renewables, no one ever called me a shill. It's just seen as like, this is the good green thing to do. But if you look at the data and the numbers, actually, we have to be honest about what's happening here. It's only good if the backup is good. The same way that we can push for electric vehicles, but if they're being charged by coal, is that actually better? Like, they need to be charged by clean sources of energy, renewables, nuclear. And on the left, we have this letter in The Guardian, which was authored by several climate scientists. The main one here is James Hansen. He's sort of known as the grandfather of climate change. He drew people's attention to climate change decades ago. He testified about it, and he continues now to write and talk about nuclear energy. And I recommend people to go and look him up and look up his videos about it, because he was, again, one of the people that helped change my mind. This is just a little picture of my kids. The reason that I'm in climate activism in the first place, you know, I cared about the planet before them, of course, but now more than ever, I think, you know, they deserve a decent future. And I don't think that that future should be ideology driven. I think it should be about actually what the solutions are, what science tells us solutions are. That comes from the IPCC, that comes from our world and data, it comes from real sources. And, you know, I just remember this every time I get, you know, attacked for being someone who is pro-nuclear. But I'm not ashamed to say that I am anymore. It's hard in the beginning when I first started talking about it, but I feel like there's a lot of shift happening, and especially younger people are kind of, they understand that we need lots of energy, understand that we need technology, you know, and also that developing countries don't just want clean water and protection from climate change. They want what we have. They want laptops and phones, you know, and we don't really have a right to tell them that they can't have those things. So I founded this new organization called Emergency Reactor. Check us out. We have a mailing list. If you sign up to that, we tell you about events that we're doing. A lot of what we do is kind of public engagement. So we just did an event in Bristol recently where we handed out bananas, which are a nice thing to hand out because they're above average radioactive. And you know, it's a good way to start a conversation with someone about radiation and then talk about nuclear energy. It's really positive public engagement. But the reason I decided to do that is because in that same spot where I did that public engagement stall with a bunch of volunteers with Emergency Reactor, that's actually a spot where normally the local CND group goes and does an anti-nuclear stall with lots of misinformation. So after I saw that, I thought someone should probably try and combat this misinformation, because actually it really matters now. And I don't think you can fight for climate justice and clean jobs and not recognize that nuclear has just been like left off the table, and that actually, thank goodness, we have an option that is clean energy, and that is substantial, reliable clean energy, because if we didn't, we would stay on fossil fuels forever. The alternative is blackouts. We have just renewables, and then we have blackouts when it's not windy or sunny enough. I mean, that is not a way that anybody wants to live. That's a horrible way to live. And now with all the gas shortages, people are starting to worry about blackouts for the first time actually in the developing world, because we've been the developed world, we've been very lucky that we're very privileged and everything just works. You know, the lights just work, the heating works, your phone just gets charged. Well, imagine if you didn't have all of that. Then imagine that over 2 billion people in the world live in that kind of energy poverty every day, and they don't want to. And they want solutions, and there are lots of solutions. You know, in the same way that electric vehicles are solutions, countries like India, they're facing water shortages because of frequent drought and increasing temperatures. A UN report has found that 40% of India will lack access to water by 2030. This is really soon, and we've known about this for some time. So one of the biggest solutions from the scientists is desalination. You create a desalination plant, it takes ocean water and it makes it into drinking water. But guess what? It requires huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of energy. And actually India, the good news with India is they're actually building lots of new nuclear reactors because they've realized this. So, you know, there will be consequences that they have to suffer in the meantime, but they might just get to a good place. But really, if you want to talk about climate justice and climate action, you have to look at countries like ours, like the countries in the West, the wealthy developed nations that are still pumping out fossil fuels just because we're wedded to this ideology of, you know, getting to 100% renewables, but not using nuclear, which goes against what the scientific consensus is. So, you know, I'm ultimately here to tell you that you're going to talk about green jobs. These are the green jobs, renewables and nuclear. These are the green jobs, and any kind of campaigning that educates people about this, because like we see with vaccines and COVID, that information, when it becomes misinformation, actually has real consequences, and it does, you know, it does damage people's lives. So I appreciate that was a lot of information to take in. I'm going to stop slide sharing now so that you can ask any questions. Put my video on and hand it. Do I need to hand it back over to the host, maybe?
Yeah, thank you, Zion. Thank you for that. That was very, very enlightening. You really highlighted how much nuclear is really needed for the transition from fossil fuels. Yeah, thank you for that. I guess we'll move on to the Q&A session now. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute or type it in the chat, and I'm sure Zion would be glad to answer them. Feel free to be, it can be on anything really. On what Zion just said, maybe on her career, or like how she got into the career, or on the climate crisis in general. Yeah, I guess if no one has any questions, maybe, oh yeah, Simran, you have a question? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I just wanted to ask how you got into the climate industry. When did you first learn about this whole emergency, and when did you start actually doing something about it? Like, how old were you?
So actually, I was doing stuff when I was so little. I was young, growing up in the 90s. That's how old I am. And I remember I used to try and make my parents recycle, and back then there was no curbside recycling. So like you couldn't just leave stuff outside. You know, that happened because environmentalists pushed for it. And so we would have to collect all the bottles. We'd have to go and find a bottle bank and put them all in the bottle bank. And it was, you know, a big deal for my parents. And I think then originally they were annoyed by it, and they were like, why is she doing this? Other kids don't care about this stuff. But eventually they kind of gave in. And then I started learning about animal rights, and I wanted to be vegetarian. That was another big issue for them. Like, why does she want to do this? You know, they just kind of came from a country where there wasn't access to meat and they were vegetarian. Then they came into British culture thinking, oh, we should eat meat. Lots of people eat meat. And they were like, why is she doing this? You know, so quite young, I was worrying about these issues, and I cared about the planet. And then it was really when I got to university that I got properly involved, because I helped to found the first like environmental group at Reading University, and it never existed before. Like there didn't used to be one, or a vegetarian and vegan society, which I also founded. So this was, you know, talking like 15 years ago now. And through that just started meeting other people that had similar interests, and you know, building up contacts essentially who would then say, well, will you write about this issue for me, write about it in the school newspaper. But then I went on to write in actual newspapers and magazines, and then there was a whole internet boom of so many websites. So I kind of got into freelance writing first, which was just a skill that I honed. Then I was offered the book deal, so I had the book published, and because it was kind of big news, it was in the Telegraph and they called me Britain's greenest mum, then it kind of just skyrocketed from there. And I did writing for a long time. I supported myself as a writer for a long time before Extinction Rebellion came along and said, they offered me the position and said, will you be our spokesperson? We've seen your work. We need more people with your voice. And I did that for about a year, wanted to be helpful. And I felt that it was helpful. And they did, you know, they did offer some what they call voluntary living expenses. So it's essentially like they cover what you're losing through not working. So I did that for a little while. And then I decided I wanted to quit that, and I kind of started talking more about nuclear, and I thought no one's going to like this, everyone's going to be really angry with me. But actually then I got offers of funding from people who are not in the industry, like just entrepreneur types who were like, I've cared about this for ages and you're talking about it and we want to fund it. So that's actually how I ended up in this position where I'm very lucky, because I basically get to do the kind of climate activism that I want, and I'm just funded to do it because I have that long history of doing the work and that a broad base of knowledge. So it's a very positive story for anyone who wants to get into this kind of work.
All right, hope that answers your question, Simran. Kirill, do you want to speak up?
Yes, hello. Thank you for your very interesting and insightful talk. And I was just thinking that, well, since we're here in Imperial, a lot of us do careers in science, and we kind of really, many of us want to solve the world's problems with it. But like personally, working in life sciences, I sometimes feel it extremely annoying, and sometimes you just want to bang your head against the wall when you're talking to someone and you're trying to persuade them about some scientific facts, which are in fact scientific and obviously seem obvious to you because you've done so much research in it. Do you think maybe you could share some insights about talking about scientific truths without talking down to people and without being annoyed to them?
Sure, yeah, this is a good point. So thing that I found interesting is when I was in Extinction Rebellion, it's very much made up of, you know, artists and actors and writers, and their communication skills are really, really good. So, you know, we came up with terms like net zero and climate emergency in our media team, and now those terms are used around the world, and most people don't know they came from us. You know, climate crisis, that came from us. And their communication skills were really good, but their grasp of science was very, very poor, very poor. And then I kind of have come into this other side, which is talking about energy and electricity. A lot of kind of energy nerds, engineers, nuclear physicists, like really clever people who are really, really, really clever on the science, but the communication skills aren't there. So I kind of look at these two groups and I just think if these groups work together, like the world would have no problems, but that's not how the world works. So what we really need is more people in the middle doing the science communication. And when I realized this, I went back to university. I went to UE in Bristol because they have a really good science communication department. And I did a master's there. And that was really, really helpful for learning the tricks on how to talk to people without talking down to them, you know, giving them the right amount of information, because that in itself is a skill, and there is research on how to do that, but it varies for whether you're talking about energy or vaccines or whatever you're talking about, and what group you're talking to and in what context it's in. So I actually really recommend something like that. I'm not saying go away and do a master's, but they do kind of like day courses, online courses, things like that are really useful for honing your communication skills, because if you've already got the scientific bit, then you've already got the hardest bit, to be honest. But we desperately need more people in that space learning how to communicate with these groups, because, you know, it is like banging your head against the wall, actually. But I think if you have a scientific knowledge, then you almost have a duty to learn the communication of it, because it's so important. It's so important, and nothing will change until we really kind of crack that nut. So good luck. I hope you can do that.
Thank you very much.
All right, perfect. Pranjal, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. I actually had two questions. The first one was to do with specifically to do with nuclear energy. So I wanted to know what you think about nuclear energy's safety, and obviously I completely agree that it should be a part of the energy mix, and it's an important part to see genuine change. But like in terms of research, it's obviously been kind of impeded. So do you think the safety standards meet the requirement to actually deploy it internationally? And my second question was to do with the Energy Charter Treaty and what your take is on it.
So in the UK, our nuclear energy is too safe. It's so safe that, for example, I've spoken to people who work on these sites, like people building Hinkley. I went and I did a tour of Hinkley and looked at the reactor and stuff. And it's to be filmed for a documentary about nuclear. And people there were complaining about, like, the safety standards are so crazy high that if you run out of duct tape, you have to buy one specific brand of duct tape that's been like through the health and safety, and that's the one you have to have on site. So it can slow down work for a week if you can't get hold of that one duct tape. And so what happens is it makes the process take really, really long, and it doesn't have to. The fact is that it's already very safe. So the few instances where there've been meltdowns, like I said, in Fukushima, actually, that didn't harm anyone. The power plant meltdown didn't harm anyone. So that was fine. It was safe. But the reporting was very misinformation based and scared a lot of people. But, if you look at something like Chernobyl's a better example of a bad case, because, look, they didn't deal with that well and people were harmed. But actually, it's still less people that are harmed than, coal explosions, gas rig explosions, fossil fuels, basically. But still, we want to minimize that. We want it to be as safe as possible. And actually, the problem with Chernobyl is that they were using an old reactor called an RMBK reactor, which is not used anywhere anymore. And the other problem is that they didn't tell people that there had been a meltdown and they didn't evacuate. So a lot of people got sick. So there are lots of different things that were going on in all of these instances. But what I would say is that it is plenty safe, and it's on each country to make sure those measures are in place. The UK is doing it so over the top that then it takes so long to build power stations, and then people complain that it takes too long. And I agree, it shouldn't take that long. In Japan, they built new reactors in 6 years. That's how long it should take. It should not take decades. We should just be cracking these things out, just become decarbonized the way that France is. If France did it in the 70s with older tech, with less robust safety measures, I would imagine, and they've never had a single problem in all that time. They've had very, very low emissions. So, I think this is a problem, that people think nuclear and they think, is it safe? Whereas actually what we should be thinking is, most of the world uses fossil fuels. Is that safe? And those fossil fuels are leading to millions of deaths a year through air pollution and driving catastrophic climate change. I mean, they couldn't be less safe, but it's interesting that we don't ask that question about that industry and the deaths that happen because of oil spills and gas fire, coal-fired power stations going on. This just happened recently. I don't know if you saw this week, there's an explosion at one of them. There's really toxic chemicals that they're throwing into the air that makes everyone around them sick. We shouldn't be using this technology in the 21st century at all. So we've really got to embrace and overcome this idea that nuclear is not safe, and embrace the fact that the very few disasters that have happened have hardly harmed anyone, whereas what we're mostly reliant on, which is fossil fuels, are harming lots of people. It's a science communication thing really, because it's about risk assessment, but typically people aren't very good at risk assessment. So communicating it is important. Energy Charter, do you mean specifically for the UK or globally?
Yeah, I mean for the UK, because yeah.
Actually, the UK is not bad. We are trying very hard to wean off of fossil fuels. We have set strong net zero goals. But if you look at the IPCC report, it says we need to build about 5 times our nuclear capacity. And if you look at what the government's promised, they've promised 1 new power station after Hinkley. So they're promising it, but they're not doing the math, is what I would say. And I don't want to hear them just saying we're going to have clean energy by 2035. I want to see the spreadsheet that shows the numbers to add up to that. And until we see that, unfortunately, it's just words and it's not going to happen, which is a shame, because it could happen. As I say, Japan's doing it, building reactors, and Russia are building reactors in 6 years. We could do that. We could fully decarbonize in under a decade and have low emissions. You know, that's the goal, right? But it's not happening yet. So none of these charters really go far enough because they're not backed up by the data. And the best data is the IPCC report energy section by working group 3. And I suggest people look it up. It's very data dense, but if you understand science, if you understand data, then it's really eye-opening to look at what that report actually says about the nuclear capacity we need and how quickly we need to build it.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. It's really striking how normalized fossil fuels has really become in society, that you kind of just ignore the inherent dangers they have. Yeah. I guess, Kara, do you have a question?
Hi, thanks for such an interesting talk. I was just wondering, do you feel that opinions on nuclear energy are changing now? And what do you think is the best way to get environmental activists to start considering nuclear energy as a possible solution?
Yeah, so I do think that the opinions are changing. So I think this is happening for several reasons. So the traditional environmentalists that have been against nuclear, like, you know, Greenpeace and Sierra Club, these kind of boomer environmentalists, they grew up with this fear of Cold War. They confuse energy with weapons. There's a lot going on there where they have a lot of fear, and they're still, you know, there's still very loud voices who are rejecting it, apart from a few people like George Monbiot, who did change his mind, but he did used to be anti because he was part of that movement. When I speak to younger people, and I have done a lot of these talks around different universities in the UK, younger people, they care about climate justice. They understand that we need the technology. They're not anti-technology in the way that the old school boomers are. And they want clean energy. They want solutions to climate change. And they don't necessarily just say, yeah, that solution's using less, because actually, if you say to them, we've been saying that for about 30 years, right? Environmentalists have been saying for decades, use less, but has it happened? Like, at some point you have to just take a step back and go, that didn't work, that didn't happen. And I found that if you say to someone, look, what if in the 70s, everywhere, every wealthy country had done what France did or Sweden did and built a load of reactors and now had clean energy, clean electricity, very, very low emissions, some of the lowest in the world. If everywhere had done that, we wouldn't be in the space we are now with climate change. We just wouldn't. We wouldn't be facing 1.5 warming. And so if you look back at why that happened and the countries didn't build the nuclear capacity, it was because of the boomer environmentalists. And I know that's a really tough thing to say, but I actually have said this directly to some of them where they're still pushing this anti-nuclear messaging. And I've just said, you need to step out of the way, because what did you do to help climate change? Like, these groups have done amazing work in other areas. Like, granted, you know, saving whales, rewilding, all of that stuff is great. But what good is that if you have no planet to live on? I mean, that is what we're looking at. You look at that latest IPCC report and it is so dire. And the people that are hardest hit are the people that did not burn lots of fossil fuels, and they are going to suffer the consequences. So really, I just ask these people to reconsider and just step out of the way and let young people take charge now. The unfortunate thing, it's going to be a long time before you guys are politicians and CEOs of environmental groups. You know, we need that. We need the changes to happen now. So I'm doing these talks, but I find the reception is very clearly like positive with younger people and not so positive with older people. I've even been shouted at quite a lot by some of the old school. It's always very, I have to say, white male privileged, you know, Westerners who actually have benefited from using fossil fuels, and now they're all, you know, we should use less energy, but they benefited from using as much energy as they wanted, and now they want other generations to use 60% less. This is just ridiculous argument, and I think younger people do get that. So I think the shift is happening, and the main thing is just have the conversations. And to me, it's not different to climate change, because that's what Extinction Rebellion did. We forced a conversation on climate change, and now look at where we are. Whereas before that, when I was Camp for Climate Action 10 years ago, no one wanted to talk about it, no one cared about it. I even wrote a Huffington Post article, which is still online somewhere if you look for it, and it was like, the title was, can we talk about the C word now? I was talking about climate change. It was like clickbait to get people to click it. No one wanted to talk about it. So actually, in just, you know, Extinction Rebellion's been around about 2 years. So just that time, Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future have managed to shift that conversation. So that's what I'm now trying to do about, you know, climate solutions. The main thing is nuclear energy. It's not a silver bullet, but it is the main thing. And if we don't start building them now, then we're going to have this same conversation in 10 years. And at some point, it will just be too late to build them. And then, you know, there's no going back from that, really, is there? But if we'd all built them in the 70s, you can't argue against basic data like that. So yeah, just, you know, I urge people to go away and talk to people about it and look at the articles. There's so many good resources, and send people the articles that Monbiot's written, or, you know, the IPCC report, if people are more kind of data, understand the data better, because it's all in there, and you can't argue with it, really.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Zion? I guess it doesn't seem like we have any more questions, but I guess I'll ask a question of my own, maybe.
There are some hands up. I don't know if they're from previously or.
Oh, okay. Actually, Manuela, have you asked your question?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask, what exactly does Extinction Rebellion do? Is it mainly like an information channel? Because obviously I've heard of it, but I'm not sure what exactly it does.
So Extinction Rebellion is a really huge climate movement that was founded in the UK. It's taken off all over the world, and their whole thing is disruption, like massive. You will have seen stuff even if you didn't realize it was them. It's like blocking roads, disrupting events, making a big noise, drawing attention to climate change. So in the beginning, when I was involved, this was, you know, it was disruptive and it was noisy and loud, but it was useful. It got journalists talking about climate change, and now everybody's talking about it, so it's great. But they're still doing that, but they don't push for any particular solutions. So they believe that, they essentially believe that the system is wrong, and they want a complete overhaul of the political system. They want like a revolution, basically. So they're not so much about climate solutions, but they've sort of become very associated with the climate movement because their original messaging was about climate change. So I left because they became more about overthrowing the system, and that's not really my thing. But they did do a good job in getting climate change talked about and on the agenda.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much. I didn't know that. So, like, does it not work with scientists and everything?
They do have some scientists in Extinction Rebellion. They have a few, but I mean, even scientists can, you know, they might be brilliant in their field as a biologist or a paleontologist, but that doesn't necessarily mean they know about energy. Doesn't mean they've read the IPCC report, you know. So, but there are people in Extinction Rebellion who are more science-minded. You know, I was the spokesperson, but their core message is still that they want to, like, overthrow society. They want to change the political system. They don't want the system that we have. They want what they call a citizens' assembly type democracy, where people vote for things, and they don't have representative leaders. So it's very complicated. But it's all, you know, you can look it up online, all the information's there, but they're more of like a political movement than about climate action. But most people do assume that they're about climate, which is not true.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll look.
thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Simran, do you want to have another question?
Yeah, sorry, I had a second question. Do you think that a rift is growing between different groups of environmentalists? And do you think that we're going further apart or coming closer together since the climate crisis became?
Yes, I think a rift is growing. I think a huge rift is growing between younger people and the older groups. I think the rift is growing on what the solutions are and on whether we follow science or ideology. I think there's quite a lot going on at the moment, but I also think that's a good thing because I think environmentalism has been very stagnant for a long time. And when I was in that movement, I mean, I'm in the movement now, but when I was in the kind of more traditional movement before I started my own group, when I wrote my book, I had a chapter on vaccines, and I cannot tell you how horrible people in the movement were to me about vaccines because the green parents tend to be anti-vaccine. They said that I was like a big pharma shill and all this stuff. And I realized then, like, whoa, that movement has a lot of dangerous perceptions because they believe vaccines are chemicals, they're bad. Whereas actually, if you have a scientific understanding, you know that everything is chemicals and it doesn't just mean they're bad, you know. But anyway, I realized then that there's kind of an issue here. And now you see the same thing with nuclear energy. So actually, either the movement needs to change to embrace science, or it is not actually a movement in favor of anything because they cannot have good solutions if they are anti-science. And this is something I've been saying very loudly, but I'm not the only one. A lot of people are saying it. So I think it could be a good thing if it evolves into something that is more evidence-based. And, you know, scientists and kind of the activists start working together more. I think actually we aren't going to solve the world's problems unless this happens.
All right, thank you for that. Do you have any more questions? I guess if not, we are running nearly to the stop time, so we might leave it at that then. Thank you once again, everyone, for attending. Of course, thank you, Zion, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
and do visit my website, emergencyreactor.org, and sign up to my mailing list so you can get involved with things.
Yeah, we linked a lot of the websites you mentioned in the chat, so if anyone wants to check those out, definitely feel free to do so. The recording of this session will be made available on YouTube later, and yeah, please approach me or Bridget if you have any suggestions for future events for Environment Society. And if you want to join EcoCareers with us, feel free, of course, to give us an email as well. Yeah, I guess have a great evening then. And
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you again, Zion.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.